So this is lecture 2 on the role of Germany in the beginning of the Cold War. So this is for Western Civ 2, mostly 10th graders. And this is the second video you need to watch during the upcoming week. Okay, so we talked about Eastern Europe. The Soviets, by the end of 1946, the very beginning of 1947, had shown their colors in Eastern Europe. They had completely taken over the governments of Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and they would quickly have the Czechoslovakian government as well. Yugoslavia, incidentally, was a special case. The Soviets hadn't really liberated Yugoslavia. The liberation of Yugoslavia was largely done by Yugoslavs. It was done by a man named Marshal Tito and his partisan bands. He had rebels against the Nazis. Now, Tito was himself a dedicated communist, but he was not necessarily subservient to Joseph Stalin. So in Yugoslavia, the Germans were largely beaten by Yugoslavs, the leader of whom was a communist, but not in Stalin's back pocket. And the Soviets did very little to help Tito because he wasn't a Stalinist-type communist. So after the war, they did help Tito form a communist government in Yugoslavia, but the Yugoslav communists were never 100% on board with Stalinism. They always went their own way. They allowed a little more personal freedom, a little more economic freedom, not complete domination by the state, the way that the rest of Eastern Europe would follow the Soviet model. They would always go a bit their own way throughout the entire Cold War. So while the United States certainly didn't see the Yugoslav communist government as an ally for the next 45 years, they often worked as a kind of go-between. They were a little bit on their own. They refused to be completely swallowed up by the Soviet bloc the way the other Eastern European states did. So Yugoslavia, you got to put an asterisk by it. Yes, communist government, but not Stalinist. Not 100% integrated into the Soviet defensive system, the Warsaw Pact, it would eventually be called, the way the other Eastern European states were. Okay, but now to Germany. Germany was the reason the war was being fought, of course. Hitler's invasion of Poland and then of the Soviet Union, his capture of France and the Low Countries, Norway. He is the reason for World War II in Europe. Adolf Hitler. And the Soviets from the East and the British and the Americans and smaller numbers of Free French forces from the West close in on Germany between January and May of 1945. By the time Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, almost every portion of Germany was occupied by Allied troops. There was a little bit up near Denmark and a few places down like the Alps that were still in German army hands when they surrendered, but they surrendered unconditionally to the Allies on the 8th of May, 1945. That's called VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. So that left the Allied armies in control of Germany. There are, I think it was something like 60 million Germans. Millions had been killed, but the vast majority were still alive. They were largely homeless as far as city dwellers go. The cities had been bombed to smithereens in most cases. There were, Soviet, American, British, French troops all over the country. It was a chaos. And somebody had to bring order to that chaos. So the Allies had to come up with a mechanism to rule Germany after the collapse of the Nazi government. What they decided to do was basically to hand over control of each portion of Germany to those armies that occupied it. And the French were carved out a small section in Western Germany, although they weren't largely in charge of that. They were given it to oversee because they were, allies, even though the Free French forces had been fairly small numbers based in London. But they had fought after Normandy and so on. They'd credited themselves pretty well. Anyhow, Eastern Germany, northeastern Germany at least, was handed over to Joseph Stalin. That's where his sources were. This included the capital, Berlin. Now, one of the things Stalin did almost immediately was seize part of it and give it to Poland. Stalin basically shifted the whole nation of Poland to the west. He seized a third of what had been pre-World War II Poland and took it for the Soviet Union. And he compensated Poland by taking a big chunk of what had been Germany before World War II and giving it to the new communist Polish state. So Poland got literally moved to the west about 300 miles by swallowing up a piece of Germany and surrendering a piece in the east to the Soviet Union. This meant a lot of Poles had to move. A lot of Germans fled what had been the homeland of their ancestors for generations, and it was occupied then by Poles. So Poland was rebuilt, and part of Germany was lost, handed over to the Poles by Stalin. The Western Allies did not concur in this. In fact, the United States would not agree to this until Gerald Ford, I believe it was late 1975, maybe very early 1976, would finally admit that Poland was where it was now. In any event, Stalin was given what's now northeast Germany, what is today northeast Germany, because he got a much bigger piece and he took part of it and gave it to Poland. All the area around Berlin. The United States was given roughly a third, maybe a little more than a third of Germany, and largely in the south and southwest. The British got northwest Germany, and the French got a bit called the Ruhrland, which is next to France and is an industrial region. So the four allies divide up Germany into what's called zones of control. And there were councils where the four allies were supposed to collaborate in governing these areas, but everybody knew that you had control of the area. You basically said what happened there. The Soviets quickly went about finding socialists and communists from the pre-World War II era to put in charge of civilian administration under their guidance. The Western Allies went about finding what civil servants they could who were not too high-ranking Nazis. All over Germany, they went through a process called denazification, where they tried to get the worst of the Nazis out of government. But an awful lot of people had joined the Nazi Party just for their careers or something. So you couldn't really get rid of all the bureaucrats who'd been members of the Nazi Party, because then nobody who knew how to run the government of Germany would have been available, basically. Because Hitler had been in power for 12 years. So the Western Allies denazified as best they could, but they set up civilian administrations under their guidance that would run the western half of Germany for 4 years. But the real question is about the future. Well, okay, one more issue. Berlin itself, the capital itself. Now, Berlin was a heap of rubble. The bombing of Berlin by the American and the British Air Forces and the occupation, the seizure of Berlin by the Red Army had left just a devastation. The heart of Berlin was just rubble, nothing left. People were living in basements under collapsed buildings. It was a horrible nightmare place. But it was still the capital of Germany, Berlin. So that they decided that all four allies should have a piece of Berlin. The Soviets got essentially half, slightly less than half of Berlin for their sector. The Americans got about a quarter. The Brits got a fifth, and the sliver was left over for the French, again, symbolic that they were allies. Pretty quickly, the British, Americans, and French consolidated their zones of control in Berlin into one unified authority. And the Soviets went their own way. They weren't interested, frankly, in having the Western Allies say what happened in Berlin, in their part of Berlin. And this would set a tone for the future. The Soviets more and more would have a vision of the future of Germany that was diametrically opposed to the Western Allies' ideas about the future of Germany. So you see that the Russians, who are most of the Soviets, the Russians had been invaded from the West by Napoleon, remember that, back in 1812. And then by World War I, the Germans had seized a good chunk of the Western Russian Empire in World War I before they were finally beaten. And then in World War II, Hitler had gotten to the gates of Moscow and what's now St. Petersburg, then was Leningrad. So the Soviets were obsessed about never again will armies attack us from the West. This was why they were so adamant that Poland and Romania and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria had to be communist and under their control. They wanted what's called a cordon sanitaire in French, a healthy belt, a belt to preserve the health of the Soviet Union, a belt of countries under their control but not part of their country, you see. So if an enemy attacked from the West, the fighting would happen there, not in the Soviet Union. So if an attack ever came on the West, the communist bloc from the West, it would happen in Eastern Germany or Poland, not in the Soviet Union itself, the fighting. Okay? So they wanted this cordon sanitaire in Eastern Europe, but they also wanted Germany utterly defanged, as they would have put it. We don't want a Germany, they said, that had the industrial capacity to build another army that could attack us. So Germany has to be turned into an agricultural country. Now, keep in mind that before World War II, Germany had been the second largest economy on earth. And now the Soviets want to strip it of its industry. Now, the Western Allies said, no way we can do that. Germany is right in the heart of Europe. You can't have a medieval agricultural state in the middle of a modernized, industrialized Europe. It won't work. Too many people right at the heart, too much knowledge of technology. It's got to be an industrial state again. We just have to make sure they're not prone to violence. That's the Western idea, that they be democratic and not build up a vast army to invade their neighbors. That's the Western idea. But to make a modern industrial state where people could thrive was the goal of the British, Americans, and French in Germany. Two very different visions of the future of Germany. And they would never reach an agreement. They couldn't even reach a peace treaty because whatever Germans they planned on calling in to negotiate the treaty on the German side, the Allies themselves, the Soviets, would always have a totally different idea what the treaty should look like than the Western Allies. So no peace treaty with Germany would ever be signed until technically one was signed in 1990, after the end of the division of Eastern Europe. So that's what begins the Cold War proper. Things in Eastern Europe were a real hassle, but the Western Allies were deeply disturbed by the fact that the Soviets would not let Germany be whole and revived. And in fact, by 1947, it is 100% clear to everybody that the Soviets are not leaving Germany. They are going to keep their chunk of the zone of control under their thumb. A couple of years later, they will establish a communist dictatorship in East Germany. They called it the German Democratic Republic. For people of my generation, we usually just called it East Germany, but the Deutsches Demokratische Republik, DDR, or GDR in English, was a communist dictatorship that would be set up in 1949 in the Russian sector of Germany, with its capital in East Berlin. The West would follow suit by helping the Germans in West Germany and West Berlin form a free democratic state based on the United States Constitution, actually, the Federal Republic of Germany, Bundesrepublik Deutschland, the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, to people of my generation. For 45 years, Germany would be divided from the end of World War II until March of 1990, when finally East Germany will join West Germany. Those 5 states of East Germany will join the Federal Republic of Germany. So the Germany we know today is the Federal Republic of Germany, joined by those 5 former communist states in 1990. 30 years ago now. But in 1949, Germany was permanently divided, everybody thought would be permanently divided, between a communist East Germany and a free democratic West Germany. And that West Germany began to re-industrialize, with American help especially. We'll talk about that next time. And by the mid-1950s was a major industrial state again, and a thriving democracy. So West Germany became a model democracy, while East Germany continued to languish under Soviet communism. But that's the beginning of the Cold War in Europe. We'll be back with a lecture for you for the next day. Thank you.